Oh, yeah.
Don't worry about the video cameras and stuff. They're mostly focusing on that. Welcome to the Computer Security Seminar. This is the last one for the spring semester, 2011. The next one will be in August. Our speaker today is Eric Katz, and he of Purdue University. He will speak on mobile phones and evidence preservation. Eric.
Thank you. All right, can everybody hear me? I want to make sure. All right. Well, my name's Eric Katz. I'm a former master's student here, and now I'm a PhD student. And the presentation I'm giving you is based on the results of my thesis research. So, everybody here probably is carrying a mobile phone right now. I can't imagine anyone related to CERIAS not carrying a mobile phone. And mobile phone use has just skyrocketed in the United States. Approximately 90%, it's currently at 89%, but almost 90% of all US citizens own at least one cell phone. Some of them have multiple subscriptions for multiple phones. And they store a ton of information about their users. If you stop and think about it, that phone knows more about you than you probably know about yourself at this point. When was the last time you remembered your friend's phone number? When was the last time you knew what time a movie was playing? Or looked up how to get somewhere? Chances are your phone is responsible for all this information now. And it never gets rid of it. Oh, my list got cut in half. Okay. That occurs when you switch from Macs to PCs. There are a lot of different types of evidence. We have apps, call histories, contact lists, documents, emails, EXIF data, GPS, SMS, MMS. Before I made the conversion, there were actually three of these items highlighted in green. That's call history, contact lists, and SMS. And that's because these evidence are on all types of phones, going back since mobile phones were really popular, or since mobile phones were pretty much developed, especially as we know them today. The call history is just a list of every call you've ever made or received. Your contact list, well, everybody knows hopefully what that is. It's every entry you have saying their names and phone numbers. And SMS is what most people call text messaging. I'll go into greater details on those, but those are important because every phone has them, and they provide some of the best evidence for any type of investigation. So, this is all about your call history. It's who have you been talking to? When were you talking to them? These are important. If you call someone 5 minutes before a crime occurs and the call lasts for 10 minutes, we can pretty much assume you either were on the phone while you were doing it or you weren't the one who did it. Very good for exculpatory information. Also lets us know who you're in contact with. If we've arrested 3 people who are guilty of committing a crime and you're talking to them around that time, chances are we need to start asking you if you were involved as well. These can be potentially limited lists. Early phones, brick phones, the non-smartphones, can have limited lists, 100, 200 names. Oops. Sorry. Jumped slides on me. It's a potentially limited list for call history. And it depends on your phone model. As I was saying, it depends on your phone model. Older phones can't store as long a lists, and new entries delete old entries out of the list. This plays a good part in evidence preservation. This is one of the things we have to watch out for. Another thing we have to watch out for, even though smartphones will keep every phone call you've ever made, because they have more than enough memory built into them to do so, they may only display the most recent 500. After that, you have to forensically recover it if it's possible. But those database entries usually stay around for a long, long time. As I mentioned, this is good for alibis, both establishing them and breaking them. It's also good for establishing timelines, so you know when things were happening, what was going on. Contact list is just a list of who you know. What are their names? Their aliases. Lots of times we don't get, first and last names. We'll get Joe Bob, or Joker, or Bub. Various nicknames, aliases of people. And these are important for establishing not only who you know, but we've been using these to develop gang hierarchies and trace terrorist cells based on who knows each other and who's contact. You can start diagramming social networks based on just contact lists. They also contain good things because we can, call up the people you know, or email them, or just go find them on the street because you've recorded their address. Smartphones keep letting you add more and more information about different users. We can look, Facebook pages can be tied to them. All sorts of things are now available in contact lists, which is one of the reasons we like them. And then there's everybody's favorite short message service, otherwise known as SMS, or more colloquially, text messages. Text messaging is becoming one of the most popular forms of communication we use. If you look at the graph, you can see that in 2000 there were about 12 million text messages sent in a month, and 3 years ago it was up to 75 billion text messages sent every month. This number has only continued to increase. I just don't have the hard statistics for it. But 75 billion text messages a month. That's a lot of data. And just like your call history, sometimes those get deleted, sometimes they get stored forever. It's pretty much based on the model of phone, and that's why it's important to preserve it. There is all sorts of good information on them. People tell us what they've been doing, what they're thinking of doing, who they're doing it with, because obviously you've texted your buddy. We know who you're talking to. And for some reason, people often feel that text messages are more anonymous or somehow safer because you're not saying it out loud. And we get a lot of admissions to crimes based on text messaging. Lots of, hey, I just shot Bob. Where do I hide the body? Or, hey, would you like to buy some drugs? They forget that the phone keeps this around forever. Think about all the text messages you've ever sent in your life. Do you really want somebody reading those? Somebody they weren't intended for, such as me? You could also ask Kwame Kilpatrick how well he likes text messaging. He's the former mayor of Detroit. He forcibly resigned due to a scandal where he was having an affair with one of his aides. He, of course, denied this in a court of law, but then they revealed that there were text messages sent to his pager. That was government issue, so it was kept around forever, and the records were public, proving otherwise. So it's very common for an investigator to want to look at your SMS messages. But as I said earlier, just like your call history, the oldest ones tend to go away. And there are criminals who will take advantage of this fact. Multimedia messaging, MMS, it's a new trend. Everybody likes it. Picture mail is always fun. As investigators, we like it because people like to take trophy photos. They want to have proof that, they have a bag full of cocaine and a bunch of guns. They take pictures of them holding up their money, standing over the person they just shot. They take pictures of the person they just beat up. I'm not really sure why they do this, but they do. And then they keep it on that phone, and it stays there because they think it's safe and secure, and that no one will ever look at it. Unfortunately, that's not quite how it works. We also get a lot of videos being sent back and forth because now every phone can record video. You get all these fights that are appearing on YouTube. This is causing a lot of national sensation. You'll see it on CNN or Fox News occasionally. Some new teenagers hurt, severely hospitalized because another group of kids wanted to beat someone up and they videotaped it. Put it on YouTube thinking that'll make them popular. There are also more problematic instances. Dominic Jones was a University of Minnesota football player. He was convicted of rape due to a video he had taken of himself in an encounter with another student after she was passed out drunk. Again, very important since that's what the entire case against him was built on. Losing that evidence because of various reasons I'll discuss in the next few slides would be incredibly detrimental because then it becomes a game of I said so, she said so. And it's very hard to prove and not something you want to deal with in a situation like that. It's just a terrible crime and nobody wants to deal with it. Another one that's becoming popular is the trend of sexting, which is sending pornographic pictures and videos to your friends or romantic partners. This trend is increasing. Approximately 20 to 33% of all teenagers have done this at some point. This has made the news, especially since it deals with the last issue, which is child porn. Is sexting child porn since it's children sending to each other? When does it become child porn? Who can be in trouble for it? All of these have to be decided. A lot of that will depend again on who's received it, who knowingly received it, who sent it. Sometimes it's not the person who took the photo who sends it. This is usually a revenge case, like an ex sending on things that were supposed to be private. And with child porn, well, anything that has a picture that can store pictures or videos, unfortunately, they'll always be abused. And if this is the method that the offender chooses to store or view, once again, that evidence needs to be preserved on this phone. Otherwise, they, have the chance of getting away. Thankfully, phones store all sorts of metadata for us, including GPS, time, date, model numbers, camera information. All of this, if we can get this information, helps us track down who did what, when, and where. Again, these are attached to the files, such as those pictures. And if we can't recover the picture, we're not going to recover this. This has become a fun one for us. GPS is constantly updated on your phones. It's updating right now, even though we're in the basement of a building. It'll just keep restoring the last one until it reestablishes the signal. And it's often tagged in other files, such as those pictures and videos. It's a means of tracking the user, sometimes for your own benefit, sometimes not. Some programs like Foursquare, Yelp, Who's Here. These all use the GPS in order to provide you a better advantage so you can see what's around you quicker. Apple is also in the news for using this. They have a nice file that they've been keeping on all iPhones. It stores every tower you've ever communicated with for the entire life of the phone. Apple's not the only company that does this. If you don't think your other smartphones are recording your GPS information, you're probably mistaken. And even if GPS isn't available, they do store your tower information because they want to be able to bill you. So your cell phone provider keeps that information around for a while. It comes down to money, but it's also really useful for tracking people, which gets into various abuses that we'll discuss later. Smartphones have given us a wealth of information. Hooray for internet connections. Now we can get browser histories, cache, which includes all your cache files, your searches, your maps, your downloads, contraband, including screenshots. Once again, we'll go to the iPhone. The iPhone's so nice that when you hit that home button and the screen minimizes and goes back to your home screen, what it's just done is taken a snapshot of your whatever page you're on, whatever app you're running, whatever is on the screen. It takes a screenshot of that and temporarily minimizes it. And that's how you see that effect. And then it says it's deleted. Well, not really. It's deleted the way anything else in a computer is deleted, in which the tags that say, hey, there's information here are just removed. The information itself is still available. Email, like text messages, everybody uses them, everybody sends things. A wealth of information involved in those. And then we have more fun apps. Everybody loves their app stores. And every app that you download records more information about you and tells us a little bit more of what's going on. And they create all sorts of new interesting things that I can't even begin to go into everything. I brought up Loki Mobile here because it's available on Android and iPhones. And it asks for access to your contact list. And as soon as it has it, it tries to find GPS information on every phone number you have so you can see where everybody on your contact list is at any given point in time. That sounds great for social networking, but imagine how a child predator feels. This is great for tracking potential victims. Stalking and other things have become a new issue, a new problem. Cyberbullying is also increased by these. And so all of these can create a load of potential evidence for an investigator. Unfortunately, this evidence can be very difficult to collect. It requires a trained investigator who's had experience not only at cell phone and forensics, but with that particular model of phone. Every phone is different, and phones come out like clockwork. Every 2 weeks, a new phone is released. That means keeping up with the training is very difficult. And unfortunately, that evidence that we have, as good as it is very volatile. We have a lot of instances when this was a brand new field and nobody really knew how to do it, and everybody was just scrolling through, clicking the buttons to see what was on your phone. Drug dealers used to smash the screens on their phone instantly, as soon as they got them. Because after they programmed in their contacts and set the ringtones, they knew who was calling and didn't need to see the phone numbers. Very difficult for an investigator to deal with at the time. Now we can often extract that information, but again, that's easier on some phones, next to impossible on others. It all depends. There are also call bombs, such as text spammer, which just you send it a text message, and it will send it to a phone however many times you specify. Well, if all your information is in a text message, and you get arrested and your phone is taken, and your buddy knows this, they can just send these text messages over and over and over again until you have no call history that shows the evidence that we need. And depending on the type of phone, once that's happened, there's no recovery. There are also problems. There are programs like LockMe and OmniProtect. These programs, anybody can go in and remotely lock their phone. Supposedly they're security based. If my phone gets stolen, I can go to my computer, click a button, it sends the signal to the phone puts in a password and locks the phone. Nobody can use it, nobody can touch it. That's great, except that often these passwords can't be bypassed whatsoever, even with a court order. Which is something an investigator does not want to encounter, is a phone that's locked out and you know the evidence is there. It's right in front of you, but you can't touch it. And probably the scariest thing we have to encounter are these remote wipe features. They're definitely built as a security feature. They're built into BlackBerry Enterprise Server, MobileMe. Android has several apps. iWipe is a common app. These programs, once they're installed, just sit there in passive mode. And then they wait for the master signal to come. And then you send that signal to the phone, it starts zeroing out the hard drive of the phone. wiping out all information. The reason this is used for security is that originally it was developed by BlackBerry, and since BlackBerry deals with the corporate environment, the last thing they want is the CEO's phone to get lost or stolen and somebody to download all the data from their company off the phone. So and part of their server and the control mechanisms they created for the network administrators for those companies is the BlackBerry Enterprise Server, and its one of the major features of it was remote wipe. You click a simple button for each phone, and it'll zero it out back to factory default. No information stored on the phone whatsoever. Unrecoverable. And so that's good and important, but again, the criminals have figured this out too. And if I arrest your buddy and you see it happen, no need to panic. You just go in, click a button, phone zeroed out, case has to be dismissed because there's no evidence. Not exactly a good scenario. And so because of this, various groups have demanded that phones become RF isolated as soon as they're seized. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, SWIG-DE, Interpol, ICAP, all of these places would have, I can't really say standards, but guidelines that say that the phone should be isolated from the network so it can't communicate, and that the evidence that's on it stays how it is. There are also multiple court rulings in the United States. I didn't want to bore you guys and go through a list of all of them that were there. Some of them are quite contradictory, in fact. But most of them suggest that once a phone is taken into custody, it needs to be isolated because the evidence in the chain of custody needs to be preserved. Sounds like a fantastic idea, should be fairly easy to implement. The vendor said, yes, we can, and they sent out a bunch of shielding devices into the market. And being vendors, they claim their tools always work. They'll show that the marketing shows that they're 99.99% effective. But this whole research project started because I talked to several officers as we were doing our forensics training. And they said they didn't work, that they were receiving phone calls inside these shielding devices. Well, that's not right. It's supposed to be a forensics tool to preserve the chain of custody and preserve evidence. Well, somebody should probably look into this. So I started looking, and I got onto the vendor websites, and I got a few examples. This is some of the marketing they use. This is Paraben's Stronghold bag. This is a metal mesh bag. And you can look at their chart, and they say they're 99.99% effective for almost everything. Well, if you're a standard police officer, that looks really good. That should mean that it works all the time. Unfortunately, that's not quite what this chart is telling you. What it's telling you is that it blocks 80 decibels approximately 99% of the time. That's great, but a decibel's not a very useful number. It doesn't really represent anything. It's a number from a baseline number, and you have no idea what those baselines are because they won't tell you. And did you have a question? Okay. And just because it blocks 80 decibels doesn't mean that's enough to prevent communication. This is another bag. This is the EDEC black hole bag. Again, they have a shielding effectiveness rated in decibels and some frequencies that they say it's good at. Doesn't really give much information to someone investigating whether or not this is what the tool they want to use. This is BK Forensics. They have a mesh cloth scarf-like material that's transparent. You can see it through their logo. And they have this chart on their webpage, or they used to. And down at the very bottom of it, right before the notice, it says shielding effectiveness, 30 megahertz to 3 gigahertz times 0.6 decibels. I asked every electrical engineering professor, every radio expert I could find. They had no idea what that meant. The equation was gibberish. I have since contacted BK Forensics and they've changed it. Their website now just says 30 megahertz to 3 gigahertz. It's effective for that range, but what does effective mean? So they've done these scientific studies, I guess, and it's said that it's attenuating this much and effective in this range, but nobody's actually conducted a field test, actually tried to see if these shields block the phones that they claim they're going to block. In fact, BK Forensics very politely, and I was very glad that they were the only ones that I saw who had done it, said validation and testing is the responsibility of the customer. It would be better if validation and testing was the responsibility of the person selling it, but at least they warned the customer that they have no way to validate their own results. So, this creates a problem. I said wireless preservation devices don't always prevent communication, and that's very, very bad for forensics. And as I talk to some of the manufacturers of these tools, they say, well, they fail for 3 different reasons. They either don't attenuate enough because the bag's materials just aren't strong enough or capable enough. There are leaks in the shields, usually at seams. A lot of these bags use Velcro when sewn. The chests have to be welded together and the lid's closed properly. Otherwise, RF signal can leak out. And all the shields are made of some form of metal substrate, usually nickel, copper, and silver. Unfortunately, when you put these in contact with a phone, that can act as an antenna extender. And so the device that you're supposed to use to shield a phone to keep it from communicating actually improves its communication capability. This is a pretty significant problem because it's hard enough to get forensic evidence off of a phone. And there are also a lot of international standards that call for these shields to be used and to work. Again, I use standard loosely. It's not a formal standard anywhere. It's an accepted guideline in practice. And for some reason, no one had ever tried to test the phones in a scientific manner, or the shields in a scientific manner to see if they block the phones. You would think that would be really, really important to do. But policymakers have been spending thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on tools to prevent cell phone communication, to save lives, and it's never been field tested. I spoke to military intelligence officers who were very keenly interested in this research because out in the field in Afghanistan, Iraq, and any number of places where they're running intelligence bureaus, one of the important things to do when you have a phone is to isolate it because you don't want it setting off an IED. So you put it in the shield, put it in the back of your truck, you start driving, and the bomb goes off anyway. That's a problem. And you would think somebody would have tested this before putting it out in the field to be worked on. So I set out to test several different shielding devices. I wanted to test them with different phones, different networks, because there are 2 different networks used in the United States, CDMA and GSM. They operate with slightly different frequencies. That may play a factor in whether or not a shield is capable of blocking it. I wanted to try different types of communications, different transmissions to see if different calls provided different results. And I wanted to try and see if distance mattered from the tower or if the call would go through no matter what. And the goal was to allow officers, whether they be police, military, corporate, whoever, to know that if they can expect their shielding device to fail and approximately when and where they'll be in trouble. And hopefully my other goal was to provide insights for testing future tests to design a better, more elegant solution, and also to help implement improvements for the vendors. Without scientific proof, without being forced to formally acknowledge that there's a problem there, they're never going to change their product. Hopefully we can make their products better and give them a little insight into how things are actually working when you take it out of a laboratory environment. There were some limitations and delimitations. One of them, there's a lot of phones, a whole bunch. And unfortunately, for some reason, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, they want to charge me money for them. And Purdue's budget is limited. So I couldn't buy every phone I wanted to test. I also couldn't buy every shielding device I wanted to test. These devices usually range anywhere from $30 to $5,000. Depends on the device. So I decided I was going to test only professionally made shielding devices. This was a pilot study. I wanted it to have a lot of scientific weight. And police officers were suggesting all sorts of interesting tools, such as paint cans, Dorito bags, Taco Bell wrappers, anything they could think of that might help isolate the phone they were trying to use. And as much as I would love to test those, I stuck with professional devices, and I limited my communication to just voice, text message, and picture messages. There are more communications, but these are the three big ones, so those are the ones I went after to test. Again, it cut off my column, but AT&T I had 4 phones, Sprint I had 5 phones, and Verizon I had 4 phones. However, T-Mobile unfortunately wasn't involved in this experiment simply because I didn't have access to the phones, going back to the budget restraints. These were my shielding devices I used. You saw pictures of some of them earlier. Instead of the BK Forensics, I actually went to the manufacturer of the material and bought the material directly from them, so it didn't have the BK Forensics stamp on it. Same idea though. The chest you see is from Ramsey Electronics. It's actually about 3 feet long by 2 feet wide by 2 feet tall, so it's really bulky and hard to carry. And there's one bag I didn't find a picture for from MWT Materials. But like the other ones, it's a small pouch. You drop the phone in, seal the Velcro. Supposedly the phone stops working. Yay for my columns. I'll fix this for anybody who wants to have the slides afterwards. I decided that I was going to find towers for each of the networks, located far away from town so the signal can't bounce off of anything and nothing can interfere. I was trying to get direct, clear signals, which meant I was primarily in cornfields in the middle of Indiana, next to these towers. I used those phone calls, and I did 5 different distances. I did at the base of the tower, or approximately 50 feet away because they put a big cage around it. They don't want you climbing the towers. So 50 feet from the tower, 100 feet, 150, 200, and 500 feet, just to see if there were differences based on how far away I was going in the shield's performance. I hypothesized that the shields won't isolate these phones, and that the calls with a lower signal to noise ratio are going to penetrate the shields more often. I could go into a long description of signal theory, but I chose to leave that part out of this presentation. And then the third one was, the farther from the tower, the better the shield performs. The results. I made 5,100 tests. I should have been 5,400, but 2 of the phones couldn't make MMS messaging, or couldn't do picture mail, and therefore I couldn't run those tests. So there were 5,100 calls, and overall, 53% of the time, the calls penetrated the shields. SMS penetrated most often, which was the one that required the least signal to noise, and it got 56% of the time. It penetrated through the shields. Voice calls were close, 53%. In fact, they weren't statistically significant in the difference of their performance at all. And MMS was only slightly less capable of penetrating the shields. Statistically, each of the shields performed differently. Distance did not play any factor whatsoever, perhaps due to the fact that I was so close to the towers, but that was, again, intentional. I set out to prove hypothesis 1 first, which is the shields will fail. So the closer they are to the source, the stronger the signal, the more likely failure. That was my assumption, and it turned out to be true. These are the results of all the SMS messages aggregated. Each shield you can see listed black hole bag has a pass and fail rate, so you can look at it and see the performance differences. The best performer I had was the Ramsey chest, the big one. It failed 2 text messages the entire test procedure, and that was it. And that would be really great, except that if your entire case was based on those text messages or whatever was on the phone, and your suspect had a remote wipe command. All it takes is that 1 split second for that 1 text message to get through, and you've lost all your evidence. For these to be considered forensically sound, they have to block 100% of the time. These are the voice tests. Again, aggregated. I have everything split if you'd like to see it in more detail. And MMS. This was the one that was blocked most often, and you can still see that on the best situations it's half and half. On the worst, it wasn't blocked at all. These are the individual shields performances. At the black hole bag had just under a 50% success rate, so it failed slightly over 50% of the time. And you can see, and it's a trend with all of them, that the MMS messages failed most often. You also note, and I think I forgot to explain it because it was cut off in one of my slides, all of these were tested at 0 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and 60 seconds. That's a measurement of time of how long the phone was allowed to stay in the bag before it was called. The reason for this is as you isolate a phone, its natural response in programming is to increase power to its antenna in order to try and reestablish connection to its network. To make sure that the phones weren't being initially blocked and then powering through the shield, I had to test it multiple times. And each of those tests required me literally to put the phone in the bag, call it, remove it, wait for it to fully reestablish signal, put it back in, wait 15 seconds, call it, remove it, let it establish signal, put it back in the bag, call it again. This took quite a while to get all the tests. But it turned out the longer the phone was in the bag, the more likely it was going to be blocked. Which is great, but provides some interesting ideas as to why they weren't blocked instantly. MWT and less EMF, so that would be the mesh in one of the bags, only blocked one phone. Everything else got through 100% of the time, so their charts look identical. They blocked almost no phone calls. This is bad if you're using them as your preservation of evidence. MWT presents an interesting challenge because it actually advertises itself for medical doctors to prevent their cell phones from setting off sensitive equipment inside hospitals. Well, I just proved that doesn't work, and wouldn't it be fantastic if you're walking through a hospital thinking your phone is shielded and you destroy some piece of lab equipment or ruin someone's test because the RF interference messed up the MRI machine. It's just one of those things that shouldn't happen. Somebody should have tested this in the field before it was ever released or sold to people. Paraben was the 50-50 performer. It did everything right down the middle. I don't have the statistics in front of me. Again, I built the slides to show today. But it literally performed right down the middle. This was the Ramsey bag. It was the most successful of the small pocketable items. It was the most successful bag when it came to blocking phone calls. You can see it's the only one who's well above 50%. It's the only one that performed even close to the chest. And again, I went through SPSS and analyzed this. I just didn't have the charts pre-made for this. But the Ramsey bag and the Ramsey chest both performed statistically the same most of the time. The Paraben bag and black hole bag performed approximately the same. And then less EMF and MWT performed approximately the same as well. So these are my conclusions. The shields don't work. Not well enough to consider them forensically sound. Unfortunately, this is going to need more testing and more validation. I was the first person to test this. I had a very limited range of phones. We need to test it from a farther distance. And we need equipment so we can measure the signal strength coming to and from the towers, because that'll provide some insight that wasn't available during this test. Sprint and Verizon are both CDMA networks. AT&T is a GSM network. Oddly enough, for some reason, Verizon and AT&T had about the same performance levels for when calls were isolated and when they weren't. And Sprint did not. It had a much worse, or it was much better at isolating the phones. that suggests that the signal from the Sprint tower wasn't as strong as the AT&T and Verizon towers, and not a difference between CDMA and GSM. But without being able to go to the field and actually measure the output strength, I couldn't identify that for sure. Also, having the output strength of the towers will allow for an equation to be developed to tell you approximately what distance and how effective your shield will be at any given distance, which will be more useful for decision makers. And more forms of communication need tested. I only tried those three. I didn't try any internet connections. I didn't try email. I didn't try a comparison between 3G and 4G. All sorts of different ways for phones to communicate that I didn't test. Unfortunately, that means it's really good for defense attorneys because it means the chain of custody can be broken. You can't prove that you maintained it. You also can't prove that the evidence there has been poisoned, that somebody else didn't call the phone while it was in custody, or signal the phone, download information, that sort of thing. And so officers and prosecutors should be very, very upset by this. The products that they were expecting to rely upon aren't working. And scientists should be upset by this too, because why did we ever allow these to not be tested in the first place? And after that, I just want to say thank you and answer questions.
Question. What about cutting power by just removing the battery in the SIM card? What will that prevent the phone from being communicated with?
It will. Unfortunately, that often can instigate a password upon reboot, and those passwords are unbypassable quite often. Same with removing a SIM card. In order to get the phone to communicate again, even with the forensic software, sometimes they have to go back in, and as soon as you do that, you lose. If that password comes up, you lose the ability to communicate. Placing it in a bag creates an interesting problem because it drains the power of the phone faster.
So what about removing the battery of the SIM card, then rebooting it in a secure environment where you in a lead-lined room, whatever? I don't know how effective that would be, but
Very effective. If you remove the battery, the phone stops to communicate. However, like I said, if it's password locked,
right.
like a lot of the touchscreen phones are, once it comes back on, the password's enabled. And
What about taking out the battery, SIM card, putting it back in once you're in a secure environment?
Yeah, it would work, but you can't get to the phone once that password's enabled, and removing the battery and turning it back on.
The battery enables the password. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, I have another question.
Go for it.
Let's say there is a remote wipe and it's successful. Can you subpoena the service provider because it goes through their equipment to get to your phone? So can you capture that?
You could trace the call that was made that sent that signal to wipe the phone, but the data on the phone is gone.
Okay.
You can also get you can often get the call logs from the CDRs, which is useful, but we've already had several instances where calls that are logged on the phone aren't logged in the CDR.
Interesting.
And since that's billing information, you'd think they'd know it, but there's been a few instances where they don't have it.
One last question, if I may. You can get information from a hard drive, from magnetic drive, even after it's formatted sector by sector.
Correct.
Can you do the same thing with flash memory on a phone?
If it's just a format, sometimes. Unfortunately, the remote wipes actually zero each bit out. So it's not just a format, it's actually zeroing out, resetting the transistors themselves. And there's no data. There's no means of recovery. So remote wipes are probably the scariest because those only occur on smartphones. And smartphones store the most data, have the most likely to have the best evidence on them. Unfortunately, all the phones I tested were smartphones. Another limitation of my project. And 53% of the time, so coin flip as to whether or not the evidence was safe. Another interesting fact that just remembered. All these smartphones come with touch screens. All these bags are made out of metal. You drop a touchscreen phone into a metal bag, every button on that phone just started activating. The phone does not know what's going on. I had it make phone calls, I had it activate programs, start typing in random numbers and digits. All sorts of interesting things happened on these phones when you drop them in the bag. Even if the screen, the swipe keys and whatnot were activated, because sometimes it would unlock the phone for you at random. Another issue with shielding that
Is it possible to have like a plastic lined bag with a metal mesh and a
That's
plastic? Is
one
that,
of the things I want to test is
Yeah.
what exactly do you need before those shields are no longer in contact? I think that would improve the performance if you remove the phone from direct contact with the shielding material. I suggested bubble wrap or foam rubber, even toothpicks if it holds
What is the construction of the chest?
the
Is that
chest.
not- yeah.
It was a steel frame with several layers of metal
What kind of-
wiring inside of it. It's silver, nickel, and copper, but I don't know if it was 3 separate layers or I know there were multiple layers, but I don't know how they divided it up. And then that was encased in foam rubber, and then you could put it in the chest. The chest had a nice advantage. It had filtered power feed through, so I could plug the chest into a wall once I was back at the lab. And if I had the charger for the phone, when I place it in there, I can plug it into the power strip inside the chest, and it won't create a feed-through antenna. Unfortunately, if you plug your phone, one of the problems discussed is phones increase power output to antennas when you isolate them, which causes the phone to die, and it's the same as removing a battery. Very bad. So police officers were like, well, we'll just plug the phone into the wall through the shield. Unfortunately, your power cord creates an effective antenna going out to the wall, defeating the whole purpose once again. So the filtered power feed-through is nice, but having a big chest is not going to happen. I think when it comes to law enforcement officers, they're more likely to use the bags and shields, and I'd like to see their performance improve dramatically.
Any other questions? Yes.
I know you were discussing at the beginning about how once it's password locked, there's not too much, anything anybody could do. I know that a judge can't force anybody to divulge a password. So do you think that type of law should be changed, like in like these types of investigations, to either try to force people to give up the password or impose some kind of punishment if they don't?
That's a sticky subject and has been involved in many criminal cases. I'm not going to make that ruling. I don't understand the laws well enough. From a personal privacy standpoint, I understand why you don't. On the other hand, if you look at like BlackBerry when dealing with Saudi Arabia, they had to instigate backdoors into all their password-protected phones so the government could access it. Whether that's the appropriate measure or not, I don't know. And that also, the issue changes on a phone from phone basis. I can bypass, for instance, the iPhone lockout. That password's not very secure. The phone is not very secure itself, so you can bypass that. However, the BlackBerry password, as I gave, without that backdoor, you're not getting into it. Same with SIM card passwords. Even though they're only 4 digits long, you only have 3 guesses. Once you've guessed, that SIM card's done. You'll never get the information off of it. Anybody else?
Let us thank our speaker.